time. Thanks everyone that's joined us for our final session of our first day. Thank you so much for sticking through with us. I know we had some technical difficulties this morning. So again, thank you for your patience and your grace. We're going to get started. You're in your track 2, session B, strengthening the circle, collaborating with Native nations to support Native youth. Please welcome Kim Metler from the Association of Indian Affairs to present Strengthening the Circle, Collaborating with Native Nations to Support Native Youth. We will have a few minutes for questions at the end of the session. Please limit your chat activity to questions directly to myself, the room host, to minimize distractions during the presentation. So I will now pass it on to Kim. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everybody. I have a very tiny screen, so I won't be able to see all your faces here, but I just want to say hello and welcome. My name is Kim Metler, Dosha. Mat Siridade Shish, Nahuni Dok Shish, Medase Kim Metler Ehedosh. I said in my language, hi, hello. It's nice to see you. My name is Kim Metler. My people on my mom's side are Ukrainian Jew and Czech, and my people on my dad's side are Ukrainian German. And we are also citizens of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation. I am a recovering attorney, meaning that in a past life, I represented a Native nation as in-house counsel. I did that for about 10 years. And then I started work in child welfare, not as a social worker, but I like to say that I'm social worker adjacent. I started out working with court-appointed special advocates, and then went to work for a workforce development training organization. And I worked with child welfare agencies to train social workers on the Indian Child Welfare Act and working with Native nations. And so I appreciate that I get the opportunity to be with all of you today. And um, this is different than what I'm used to, so bear with me while I'm trying to do a presentation on a tiny screen. And what I'd like to do, if I could just start out, and if I see most people have their cameras off, but I'm curious to know who here is a child welfare worker for a Native nation. If you could raise your hand, or if you could drop into the chat um, whether or not you're with a tribal nation, Native nation. There's some faces. Hi, everybody. If you could raise your hand and just let me see who's a tribal social worker that's with us today. Okay, who's a county child welfare worker with us today? Okay. Okay, got one. Um, who's here from probation or youth justice? I just want to have a sense of who I am chatting with today. No one's here from youth justice. Wow. Oh, CASA program. Yay, CASAs. All right. Okay, so this presentation is everyone here, whether you're working child welfare or whether you are a justice worker, I think you'll get something out of this. But this was really intended for folks who are working in the youth justice field. And the reason for that is because there's such an impact on our Native youth when it comes to being justice involved. And it's not something we talk about a lot, particularly the intersections with ICYF and working with Native nations. And so that's what brings me here with you today. Given the short amount of time that we have, This is going to be actually a really pretty high level um, presentation. I'll answer all your questions as best as I can. And if I can't do it here during our session, I've put my email address in the chat so you can contact me anytime if you have questions. So we're going to talk about collaborating with Native nations. And why this is important is right here. It's because Native youth are disproportionately represented in justice systems, just as they are disproportionately represented in child welfare systems. Native youth are 4 times more likely to be detained than their white counterparts. They're also less likely to receive probation or to have their cases diverted. And when they are prosecuted and sentenced, they're more likely to have harsher sentences than other populations. And according to the Sentencing Project, Washington State incarcerates Native youth about consistently and in line with the national average, which is 4 times more than white youth. The other reason why this is an important topic is because a lot of people don't know this, but most Native people actually live off reservation and away from their homelands in urban centers. 71% actually of Native people do not live on reservations. And so that makes it highly likely that you have Native youth in your care. Um, I also know, especially Washington State, I believe you have 29 or 30 federally recognized Native nations. And so that increases the likelihood that you will be working with Native youth in some capacity. So I want to talk a little bit about historical trauma. And the reason why this is important is because these are the roots of how Native youth, how our young people end up getting justice involved. And this isn't to say that historical trauma excuses their behavior or is hold means that they shouldn't be accountable, but rather this is an explanation for it. And this makes the case for things like trauma-informed, culturally appropriate care. So, historical trauma, I'm not going to recount all of the history, but some of the major events that come to mind when we talk about historical trauma include things like forced relocations. You may have heard of the Trail of Tears, which was when the federal government mandated that Eastern tribes move westward, and they ended up in what was then called Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma. But there's been other relocations, forced relocations. I think virtually every nation has experienced forced relocations outside of their homelands and many within. In the 1950s, there was a program that was intended, the thought process was to move all of the Native folks off of reservations and into cities. And then they were going to open those lands up for homesteading, public lands, or for sale. And they promised folks jobs and housing in major urban centers like Los Angeles, Seattle, Minneapolis, Denver. But what had happened was many of those folks, although they took the offer, once they arrived in these urban centers, the promises didn't pan out like they were supposed to. Um, so that's one explanation why there's large urban populations, but that's also one of the historical traumas that still impacts us today. One that many people you may have heard of are the boarding schools, which was starting in the 1800s. The federal government, in an effort to assimilate all of us, rounded up our children, kidnapped them, and sent them away to boarding schools. And the first boarding school is Carlisle, and this was actually a military school, so it was run by the military. But many of the other ones were actually run by churches. And how these were intended to assimilate us. And so it was forbidden for us to wear our traditional clothing, speak our languages, practice any of our spiritual or religious practices, even things like mourning, mourning the loss of the connection from home or our coming of age ceremonies. All of those things were hidden. And they have lasting impacts that even today we're still experiencing these. In the 1960s, as this was actually an extension of boarding schools when the boarding schools closed, there was the Indian Adoption Project. And this was a contract between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League, where they instituted this adoption project. They believed at the time that Native children were better off being raised by white families than their own families. And so these children were adopted away. And in all of those instances, their adoption or their court records are all sealed, their birth certificates have been changed. And so their connections to their original families, to their birth families, have all but completely disappeared. So all of these things have had this really lasting impact. And those unresolved traumas, that unresolved grief, has actually set the stage for the health, economic, and social disparities that we experience today. And um, when you think about Native country as a whole, we have higher mortality rates than any other population and experience things like chronic heart disease 2 times more than other populations, diabetes 3 times more, alcohol-related illnesses and mortality 6 times more, and physical assault and homicide 2 times more. And that's actually a leading cause of death in Native country. So we have all of these things that are happening. We have the stage set for us to experience these disparities. But with trauma, as many of you as you know, trauma also has biological impacts, especially if it occurs in childhood. So we have what's called epigenetics, and this is where trauma, unresolved grief is actually passed generationally. And it doesn't change our genes, but it alters the way our genes function. And so it's like it's like light switches that the way our brains develop, we may be more susceptible to certain things than to other things. And I just want to say too that when we have this conversation about trauma and about passing trauma generationally, it's always framed in this kind of negative context that we pass trauma down generation. But the same mechanisms that pass that trauma down is also capable of passing healing down. And that's part of why we're in this conversation today and why culturally centered interventions are so important and why connection to culture is so important, is that we are capable of healing and we are capable of sharing that and breaking that cycle. Um, with the altered brain development as a result of trauma, a couple things happen. There are many things that happen, but it often results in difficulties with emotional regulation, difficulties with impulse control, and maladaptive coping mechanisms. And those things all result in difficult behaviors and especially in older young people, teenagers, these trauma response behaviors ultimately are criminalized. Fighting, drug-related offenses, running away, burglary, shoplifting. In some instances, these are actually referred to as survival offenses, and they're criminalized. And this is how young people get caught up in the system. And what I maintain is that if we tend to this unresolved trauma and grief, we are able to reduce this disproportionality that we're seeing. We're able to support and heal our young people and really heal our communities and our nations. I just want to mention my favorite topic, one of my favorite topics, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, otherwise known as ICWA. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with ICWA. And in most of the time when we talk about it, we do talk about it in the context of child welfare. But it also applies in juvenile justice, sorry, youth justice instances as well. It applies when a youth is placed in foster care or other out-of-home care because of a status offense. It's a practice in many jurisdictions that a status offense is they're actually diverted and they're not prosecuted and youth are not detained. And a status offense is basically a crime that is only a crime because of the age of the person who does it. So underage drinking is a perfect example of a status offense. So the trend is a good trend, meaning that we don't want to lock kids up for a status offense. But unfortunately, sometimes a status offense isn't just that. They happen because there are things going on at home, and there is a need for placement of a youth outside of the home. And so, in that instance, that's where the Indian Child Welfare Act would apply. If you're not familiar with ICWA, what I'd like you to take away is that this was a law that was actually instigated by the association back in the 70s, and it was in response to the disproportionate separation of youth from their families. So there was a time where literally the social worker would drive out to the res, scoop up the kids, and leave. And this was during a time where parents were not notified that the children were detained. They weren't notified of the court proceedings. And oftentimes, children lost not just custody of their children, but also their parental rights without any recourse. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act was instituted to protect families. And it's really meant to guard against the unwarranted separation of children from their families. And that also applies to youth and justice systems. Um, the the whole purpose of the act, I mean, there's some things that it does, like it centers a young person's cultural identity and connection to their community, and it protects about against racial bias. But it's also intended to really to promote the best interests of the child, which is a relationship with its nation, and it's meant to protect a nation's relationship with its future, which are our children. And it does this by ensuring active involvement in court proceedings for the nation, for the child, and for either custodians or parents. It recognizes Native Nation authority and sovereignty. Through the Indian Child Welfare Act, Native nations are able to actually take jurisdiction of child welfare cases and, in some instances, of youth justice cases. And it also places preference for placement if a child has to be removed, rather than doing it the old way, which was placed with white families. The priority is placed with Native families to maintain those cultural connections. So what does this have to do with collaborating with tribes? You have to identify Native youth, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So why would we want to collaborate with Native nations? Well, because there's lots of benefits to it. And a lot of people approach this work, and a lot of times it's folks who don't have a lot of experience or don't have any experience working with Native nations. They immediately think it's going to be adversarial. And when I work with social workers, when I train the brand new social workers, I hear this a lot. There's this assumption that Native nations don't want the same things as county agencies or state agencies. And that's not true. The greatest collaborator and partner you can have, whether it's youth justice or a child welfare case, is the child's Native nation. The heart of a good practice really depends on that collaboration. And If it's a case where ICWA applies, it's not just something you should do because it's best practice. It's required as a matter of law to collaborate. But the other reasons why collaboration is good is because it really increases the pool of support. So instead of having just a handful of services or programs to support that young person, you can actually be more inclusive of culturally appropriate services. It expands the financial resource pool potentially. Um, there are things and time resource. A lot of times I've heard of children being taken in, detained under child welfare, and one of the first things they need is they need to have their health exams or their dental appointments. But through a county system, they may not get in for 1 or 2 months. Whereas if you're partnering with a nation, if that nation has their own clinic or they're part of a health consortium, the child may be able to be seen sooner. So there's lots of reasons why a collaboration can be beneficial. The other thing that I want to mention too that makes this really important is that collaboration really it connects the young person to culturally based or culturally appropriate services. If you were to, as a county agency, for example, rely only on what you think is culturally appropriate, it's, although well intended, probably going to fall short. If you are not from a particular culture, it's not possible to really fully understand what cultural practices are appropriate to connect the youth with that cultural identity, the cultural values, and specific practices within the nature. And there's research that supports the notion that culture is actually a protective factor for Native youth. So here's your process in collaborating with Native nations. First thing you have to do is you have to know whether or not this young person is a native child, or under the Indian Child Welfare Act, you have to know if it's an Indian child. The only way you can do that is by asking. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Once we know whether or not this is a Native child, the next step is to engage with the Native nation. You'll need to contact them to verify whether or not this young person is a citizen or eligible for citizenship. And also, you need to contact them to figure out how to partner with them in the best way to provide these services for young people. So, how do we identify Native youth? And why should we? Aside from this is the only way we can get to collaborate with the nation. Identifying Native youth actually reduces disproportionality. And the way that it does it is that it identifies where the disparities are. So, if we're talking about youth justice, for example, we can identify at what point in the process are young people disproportionately represented. More importantly, when we reduce that disproportionality, because if we know this is a Native child, we connect them with services that can potentially take them out of systems. Or if it's a case of child welfare, it connects the whole family and keeps the family out of systems. We can't serve young people, Native young people, if we don't know who they are. Um, What's important the other thing, and I've heard this, some of you may laugh. I've done this training, version of this training before, and someone once told me, I asked the question, how do you know which youth are Native youth? And somebody said, well, I can just tell by looking at them. And I kind of laugh, but I want to share this point because it's important, and that um, we have an image in our head of what Native people look like. Many of us are lucky to have the beautiful colored skin and the almond eyes and the black hair, long black hair, but that's not representative of who all of us are. We are not a monolith. We are a very diverse people. And you cannot tell by looking at us who we might belong to or who claims us. And likewise, there are people who believe, well, I can just tell by the last name. because some folks have names that are representative of their particular culture. But there's a long history of colonialism that impacts surnames. And so I implore people to ditch the stereotypes and just get comfortable with asking the question, right? There is a caution, there is a caveat with this. And that caution is that this may be a very sensitive subject for young people and for the other people you're going to talk to identify this Native youth. The reason it's a sensitive topic is number one, is that with all of the trauma, we were very uncomfortable with people getting in our business and asking such a personal question, are you Native? Because the response is always, why do you want to know? Right? But the other part of it is if you are a county employee or local, whether it's child welfare, law enforcement, you are the agent of a government. And historically speaking, anytime Native people have engaged with government agents, we've lost something precious to us. So there is a very long history of distrust between Native peoples and government agents. And so you need to approach this with some sensitivity and some humility in order to get the information that you need. So it's worthwhile to spend time to build some of that rapport and create a sense of safety, not just with the youth, but with other family members, members of the community that you need to talk to get this information. And you want to explain why you're asking the question. And you can do it very simply by saying, additional resources may be available to support you or to support your family or to support your child um, based on whether or not you are connected with a Native nation. And then you can just ask, can you tell me about your culture? Are you Native? You might ask the question, where's home for you? That can reveal information to help you identify whether or not this young person is a citizen of or a descendant of a Native nation. There's also, I dropped some information in the chat, some links to some additional resources, but other ways you can get to this question in identifying this connection to the Native nation, of course, is the youth citizenship. You can ask, do you have a tribal ID, a Native Nation ID card? And you would ask this of the youth or of the parents. Only citizens of Native Nation. Well, I shouldn't say that. In my experience, only citizens of Native nations are able to get tribal ID cards. That may not be true. There may be some nations that will issue if you can show a relationship, but you're not an enrolled citizen. But typically that's how it works. If you can show a tribal ID card, that will demonstrate this connection. You would ask the youth or the parents themselves, are you citizens of a Native nation? That is enough of that connection to help you make the assumption or draw the conclusion. You have a reason to know that this is a child of a Native nation. Likewise, if they've lived on a reservation, a rancheria, or Alaska Native village, that's a connection. If the young person has ever been a ward of a tribal court or has been involved in tribal court, and also if anybody has received services through Indian Health Service. I want to caution on the lived on reservation, rancheria, or village, but there's many places where people who are not citizens of that nation do reside there. And it's a complicated reason for that. Um, so that indicates a connection, but I would use that as a part of other criteria to determine whether or not this Native youth is attached or belongs somewhere. So once we have information that indicates there's a connection to a Native nation, then you contact the Native nation. You will contact them to verify citizenship or whether or not that youth is eligible for citizenship. Um, if this is an ICYF case, You're going to need to contact them to provide formal notice. And I won't get into any of that. We don't have enough time, but that's a formal process, and you have to do that in a very particular way. And the law prescribes how you have to do that. But in either event, whether it's ICWA case or you're just trying to partner, you would provide informal notice of any and all proceedings. And then, of course, you want to engage them so that you can collaborate. So, how do you do that? How do you contact the nation? Oftentimes, the Native Nation has a web page and it has all of the government numbers listed, and so you can just call. But there's also two federal directories that are published that provide this information for you. One of them, if this is an ICWA case, you want to use the BIA list of ICWA designated agents. And I think that's one of the resources that I dropped in the chat for you. You would just go to the website, type in who you're looking for, and it'll come up. That is only for ICWA cases. The Tribal Leaders Directory, you can use that for all other ways of contacting the tribe if you want. But again, if it's a youth justice case or a child welfare case, your best bet is to go with the ICWA designated list. And then for those of you, if you are, say, probation department for a county, a great resource for you likely will be the child welfare agency, your counterpart. They deal with ICWA a lot, and so they probably already have resources within their agency to help make that identification and to help make those connections. One thing I want to mention about engaging the nation and identifying the youth, it's really important to make sure you're getting the correct spelling for names and birth dates. And you always want to ask how the nation itself prefers to be identified. And I'll give you an example. There are a lot of nations out there that identify themselves by their traditional way and their traditional language. Sometimes they use an English translation of that to identify themselves, while others go by their federal government name. So my tribe, for example, we call ourselves the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation. But if you were trying to look that up on the Federal Register listing, like our Tribal Leaders Directory, you won't find it under that name because our government name is the Three Affiliated Tribes. So you have to do some diligence in making sure that you have the correct information in order to make these connections. So here's the heart of it. How do we work together? How do we have effective partnership for the benefit of young people? And I encourage you, we just released a resource at the association, Strengthening the Circle. It's the same title as this presentation. I dropped a link in the chat for you. You can download this practice guide, and it has way more information in it than I'm able to present to you today. But there's additional tips for effective partnership and different ways to collaborate. I encourage you to download that and take it with you. But I would say that to be effective in your partnership, there's a couple things that are really important. One, you need to be open to a new way of doing things. When you work in Native country and you engage with Native nations, I can guarantee you that you're probably not going to do things the way that you've always done them. And you need to be open and understanding and willing to do that. I think listening is one of the most important things that you can do in collaborating with Native nations. Really listen. If you come in and you think you have the answers and you have the right approach, you're going to miss something that's important. And it's going to be difficult to really partner in a good way and develop that trust, which is the key to this. Another thing to consider for an effective partnership is you really want to build that relationship before you actually need the relationship. It's really difficult to try to build trust and get to know your counterparts in the Native nation when you're trying to solve a problem or there's difficult circumstances. And so it's like any other time you build relations, you want to do that before you have to. And the last thing that I'd like to say about this too is building trust. There's such a long history of distrust on the Native Nation side of state and federal government and local government agencies. And that's something that I don't know if you can ever fully overcome it, but you can build trust. That is possible. And you can improve relations. That's possible. But one of the things you have to understand about that is that it's an ongoing process and it's a commitment. All right. This is my kind of, I'm going to hold your hand while I say this moment. And this is for folks especially folks who've never worked with Native nations before. And I encourage really all local, county, state, federal people to really take a look at these questions and really consider them. Because this, I think, is you have to do that internal work and really be clear about what you're about when working with Native nations. And the first thing that's important is are you showing up either in that partnership or when you're physically visiting the reservation or the community? How are you showing up? Are you showing up as a partner, as a guest? Are you showing up with humility? Or are you showing up that you are the authority? This is the way it's going to be. This is the way we're going to do it. Um, you're going to have different outcomes, and the relationship as it develops is going to develop a certain way depending on which of those attitudes you bring. So be clear about that. Um, when you're working and when you're communicating, when you're visiting, are you leading with your own cultural lens or are you adapting to the culture of the nation? Especially when ICWA applies, the social and cultural standards of the nation are elevated. They become very important in this case. And so you need to be aware of that. And you need to check in. And if you're in a meeting, for example, and this is an example that happens a lot. If you're in a meeting and there's an elder speaking, and elders tend to take a while to say what they need to say. And if you find yourself getting impatient and fighting the urge to roll your eyes and say, hurry it up, if you find that there's judgment coming in here, that's an example of approaching with your own cultural lens versus the cultural lens of the nation. Now, I know when you're in a meeting, you want to accomplish things, and it sometimes is hard and you have to check yourself. That happens to all of us. But it's really important to just start noticing that, and that invites you to a altogether different level of self-awareness than you're probably used to having in your job. But I promise you, if you're willing to pause, if you're willing to reflect in that way, that's really going to be to your benefit. Ask yourself, and this is important, especially when there's conflict. How are your decisions today going to inform or impact that future relationship? I'm going to tell a story that I've told many times before, and I'm just going to say, you don't want to be this person. You don't want to be the person that is the reason the director of the agency, the county agency, has to go talk to the Native Nation leader. So here's the story. So I'm here in San Diego County, and there's one particular, we have 22 nations here in San Diego County, and there's one nation that their tribal social worker was an elder. She'd been doing this for a really long time. And there had been a lot of contention, 30, 40 years of contention and conflict between this tribe and the county's child welfare. And through a lot of effort on both parties' side, they were able to finally get to this point where they had an MOU about how they were going to work together. And there was a young woman, her job was in the Indian Specialty Unit because San Diego County has a unit devoted solely to ICWA. And so she had developed this relationship with a tribal social worker, with this elder. And even when they got mad at each other, they could yell at each other, but they worked it out and everything was fine. And she ended up getting promoted and transferred out of the unit. And so there was a young woman that was sent to take her place. And this young woman came out and she decided in this particular case that they were working together on, she didn't think that the tribal social worker had enough experience, and she thought that this tribal social worker was doing it wrong. And there was conflict, and she disrespected the tribal social worker. So not only did she disrespect the tribal social worker, she disrespected a tribal elder. In 20 minutes of this young person being on the reservation, she undid a couple decades worth of diplomacy and effort to create the relationship that allowed her to be there. And I tell that story. She was the one, this young social worker was like, let me tell you about the first case I had in my career. So I offer that story as an example that you don't want to be that social worker, and that your what you decide and how you behave in any given moment can have that kind of a dramatic impact on the relationship. And so, the people that came before you, they created the relationship that you're walking into, for better or worse. And I encourage you all to think about, what is the relationship you want to leave behind? And it's going to take work. If you want a good relationship, it's going to take work. And ask yourself, do you want to be the reason why somebody has to work so hard to improve the relationship, right? Or do you want to do things in a good way? Then there's this last question, which to me, this is the heart of collaboration. This is the heart of being culturally, having cultural humility and being culturally responsive, is asking yourself, what is your approach here? What are you doing? What is your why? Are you doing the work you do because you want to create change? You want to really create change for families, for young people. You want to break those cycles of involvement by recognizing the needs of this young person and work to connect them to get their needs met. Or are you there because this is your job, your supervisor told you to collaborate with the nation, and you just need to get your case management done? I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, but what I am saying is that whichever way you look at this is going to influence how you show up and how you approach your work. And it can make it easier for you, or it can make it much harder. And as I said in the previous bullet point, which is that also can have impact for those who come after you. Are we done? We're done. So this is it. So there's resources I dropped in the chat before. We're gonna have Q&A, but I just wanted to make sure you all see this, is that in the chat I've put resources for you. Did I just stop sharing? Okay. I put resources for you here. Our link to our website, the Association on American Indian Affairs. If you visit our Native Youth Justice page, we have some resources there for you. But what I put in the chat is the BIA directories. So if you're looking for how to find a Native nation, the link to the webpage is there. Let's see, the BIA guidelines for ICWA implementation. I'm always a huge fan of that. If it has a lot of information in it that will help you ensure that you're implementing ICWA. And then, of course, there's a link in there to our collaboration guide. And so I encourage you to download the guide, read it over, and anytime, anytime, please feel free to contact me directly I believe my email address is also in the chat, and I'd be happy to support any of you in your work. So I'm gonna pause, I'm gonna hit the pause button, and I'm gonna check in and see if anybody has questions, comments, want to share your thoughts. And you can either drop your question in the chat or go ahead and just unmute yourself and let me hear you.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much, Kim, for your presentation.
Oh,
My name is Stephanie Gomez. I'm the Indian Child Welfare Case Manager for the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. And I did want to kind of add a little something because I know you had mentioned that living on a reservation can essentially, I can't remember what the concept was, but whether you live on a reservation as a tribal, as a tribe, as a representative of the tribe, even if you do live on a reservation, I would still make a recommendation to reach out to that designated tribe. And the reason being, because with us, particularly here within the Yakama Nation, is our dependency proceedings for child custody proceedings, it does not essentially apply to our enrolled members. If you are an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe, and you are living within our reservation boundaries, we do have a right to assume jurisdiction over your
mm,
child custody proceedings under the Indian Child
mm,
Welfare Act. And so that's why I just wanted to basically state, in the event if you are ever in that situation, as a try to caution, definitely reach out to the designated tribe that the family is claiming that they have affiliation with, but also reach out to the tribe of the reservation that they're living on as well, because they may have certain same criteria or guidelines as we do here within our reservation boundaries. I just wanted to add that.
no, thank you. That's really important. I really appreciate that you added that. That's one of the challenges of doing a presentation like this is that there are a lot of nuances and there are a lot of little tidbits of information that they might be little, but they're actually super important. And so I really appreciate you said that. And that's one thing that happens a lot. We got natives living everywhere. And they may not be living in their home territory, but that is still a native community in which they live, and that nation may have an interest, just as you said. You might want to take jurisdiction there. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Other chats, other comments, questions. Um, Simply identifying our youth in the system needs improvement. So yeah, so for youth justice systems, this was the motivator for why we created this guide, is because we don't talk about ICWA enough in youth justice systems, and that I'm making it my mission that we're going to start talking about it, and I'm going to support folks in getting training and getting familiar and implementing ICWA. But this is a basic thing, is that there really aren't systems because just because these systems are all kind of don't function well in many ways. Unfortunately, youth justice is kind of late to the game in a way, and so they're not set up to have these protocols or processes in place in order to know how to do all of this. And so I'm advocating too, like start with the basics and just make sure every young person that comes into contact with the youth justice agency, probation, whatever law enforcement this is, whatever it is, every single young person needs to be asked if they're native. Because like literally every person at first contact of don't wait till you get down the road, because if ICWA applies, you're going to cause a whole other complication. I also encourage, I'm assuming, I see the number of people that we have here. I'm assuming everyone or almost everyone is an ICWA champion here. At least I hope so. And so I encourage those of you who are working in juvenile justice or youth justice to reach out and partner with your child welfare counterpart, because the odds favor that they are going to have more knowledge and experience and they can help guide you. and you also can contact me and I can give you pointers and we can talk about how you can get what you need in order to do this. Um, as a child welfare relative search specialist, only recently learned more about how relatives are identified differently by Native culture versus Western culture. Yes. So this is one thing that's interesting, and this is in ICWA, is when we're talking about placement. So we talk about extended family, and I'm gonna just speak, by the way, I'm here in California. California has Cal ICWA, so we have an even higher standard of ICWA here in California. But our first placement preference is extended family. I think that's kind of standard across practice, right? And how is extended family defined? Well, it includes non-related people. So I might be a family friend and I am considered by the tribal nation, by my nation, as a relative. I mean, they call me auntie, so so but there's other kinds of relationships. I always talk about there are nations that rely heavily and they still are engaged with kinship systems like clan membership. So there could be, and this is why it's really important to get in and ask those questions and develop that rapport so you can get this information, because you might have an idea about how family is defined, but that doesn't mean that's the way it's defined for this young person. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. In California, there are in San Diego County, there are 22 nations, and in California, there's 112. We have the most federally recognized nations in the United States, except for Alaska. So yeah, we got a lot of us running around down here. And then lack of policies, standard procedure, reliable guidelines for line staff. Yes, standardized procedures and policies are required. I think that's necessary. I think there's lots of reforms that need to happen in child welfare and in justice systems. And I'll say that I think it needs to start with the desire for change. Because in my work, I've talked to lots of folks, both in the legal side, the law enforcement side, and child welfare side. And there are a lot of people that think things are just fine. And so this is why I want to encourage my ICWA champions, my justice reform champions. If you really stand for the young people, if you stand for healing our families and being a messenger and a carrier of that healing, it's like stand up and advocate for these things. Come to stuff like this. Educate yourself, build these relationships, because that counts and that's really important in this work as well. Thank you, Stanley, for your comment. If a Canadian tribal member is living in a Washington tribe, can this Canadian person be considered a US citizen? I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna throw a wrench in this question. So no, you can't be a legal citizen of the US unless you go through the US process. Can't be a citizen of the nation unless you go through the nation's citizenship process. But I am going to say one thing. We have that, I'm sure many of you have heard that saying that we didn't cross the borders crossed us, right? So on both the top and the bottom, both north and south in the United States and our borders, we have a number of Native nations that live along those borders. They're cross-border nations. So here in San Diego County, we have the Kumeyaay people. That's the cultural group of the nations that live here, and they're cross-border. There are several villages over on the Mexico side that go all the way down to Baja, Mexico. For ICWA purposes, if we have someone that says, I'm Kumeyaay, but I grew up in Mexico, I always encourage you still notice the Kumeyaay tribes. And I say that for Blackfeet Nation. I say that any nation that's a cross-border tribe. I notice them anyway because there are instances where those cross-border tribes will respond to the agency and say, for the purposes of ICWA, we recognize this child as a citizen. So what matters, so the key is the citizenship or eligibility for citizenship in the nation, the native nation. All right, working with children in the US who are enrolled also requires culturally appropriate services, and Canadian First Nations do partner with child welfare. Yes, someone that I work with, she is Canadian, she is Chisasibi Nation, and she has represented several families here that are Canadian families. And she has worked not only with the nation where the child resides here in the States, but also the nation, the Canadian side as well. And this is a great example of collaboration when you have all those resources that you can offer not just the child, but the family and the kin who are caring for the child. I mean, that's the kind of collaboration that creates better outcomes. Are there times when the tribe does not assume jurisdiction over native child? And if so, what would be the reason? Yes, there are many times that a tribe may not assume jurisdiction. And there are many reasons for that. One may be that they don't have the ability to do that, whether it's they don't have codes, they don't have their own tribal law or a body, a judicial body, whether it's tribal council or whatever that looks like. They just don't have the mechanism to assume that jurisdiction. Resources, a lot of times, although hopefully this is improving, but a lot of times a tribe doesn't have the resources to assume that jurisdiction. And it could just be simply they don't want to. I can't explain all the reasons why that might be the case. We would hope you all come and stand for your children, but it just depends on the circumstances of each nation. I know that probably wasn't as clear an answer as you would like. Do we have other questions? Other comments?
Kim, I see that Fawn Pooper has her
Oh,
hand up.
thank you. Thank you. My baby screen here. Fun. Yes.
Um, do you have tips on working with multi-nations for like the same case? I know there are some times where jurisdiction of a child that qualifies for ICWA may fall over 2 or 3 tribes. Do you have any tips on how to handle those situations?
Be patient. Learn soft belly breathing. Get a good night's sleep. Yeah, I think eh, I mean genuinely I think the first rule of thumb is to be sorry, I don't like that term. The first rule is just to be patient. I think clear communication, if anything, over communicate and just make sure you have that relationship constantly going with all of them. When you're working with a multitude of different people, I mean, there's bound to be conflict that comes up, but if you can establish protocols about how you're all going to work together, and if you're able to clearly identify at the beginning, what are our priorities here, identify who's going to take on what roles, even defining how are we going to talk to each other? Are we going to just jump on a Zoom or are we going to email? If you take the time to identify those kinds of, I guess, protocols from the beginning, that will go a long way in terms of setting the stage for how you can work together to stay solution focused and to be able to navigate when conflict comes up. And also, I would say, take the time to celebrate the wins together, to build those, to continue. It's all about the relationship. How are you caring for the relationship? Not just ticking the boxes off in the casework, but how are you nurturing the relationship so you can get the work done? Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I know that we have people kind of dropping off. We are at the hour. I just didn't want to interrupt because I know having Kim here, I want to ask so many questions as well, but didn't want to interrupt. But I have dropped in the chat, if you haven't already, detailed program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you can join us again tomorrow for ongoing presentations and new learning. Thank you again for those of you that have stuck with us. I see you all kind of dropping off, and thank you so much, Kim, for coming and sharing with us. I just love hearing from individuals such as yourself and really feeling the passion for this work. And I see Bonnie's still on and she does have her hand up, so I want to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.